At this university, it's customary to begin an academic ceremony with a prayer. Spiritus Sancti, gratia illuminet sensus et corda nostra. Please be seated. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this academic ceremony in which Marlou Poppelaars will defend her PhD dissertation, Engaging Youth in Depression Prevention. The ceremony will be held in English because of the international composition of the promotion committee. And I would like to extend a special word of welcome to the members of the promotion committee who have traveled from the United States or who are joining us from their home universities on Zoom. We appreciate your presence here today, either physically or virtually. I would also like to welcome the family and friends who I'm sure have been a great source of support for the production of this impressive book. We begin with the presentation of the candidate about her research, for which purpose I will give the floor to her now.
With the permission of the doctorate board, and in order to obtain the degree of doctor at Radboud University, I would like to defend in public my doctoral thesis entitled Engaging Youth in Depression Prevention, Testing the Effectiveness and Appeal of Applied and Commercial Video Games. Between 10 and 25% of youth can be diagnosed with depression at some point prior to adulthood. Characterized by sadness, dejectedness, and an inability to experience joy, as one normally would, depression is harmful to the individual, their direct environment, and society at large. Yet, research suggests that only a third of the harm caused by depression can be alleviated with the current best evidence-based treatment. In addition, many of depressive disorders' negative consequences already affect youth who merely experience some of the symptoms of depression. Thus, preventing the onset of depression is crucial. Unfortunately, depression prevention programs currently have only limited effectiveness. In addition, many existing prevention programs fail to engage youth, as they closely resemble regular school class and can be experienced as patronizing and irrelevant. Therefore, current programs only help some youth at risk for depression. In order for prevention to effectively reduce the burden of depression, we need programs which are effective and engage youth. Meaning we need genuine innovation in the content and delivery of prevention programs. Therefore, the goal of my dissertation was to explore the benefit of using video games in depression prevention. Video games may be excellent vehicles for depression prevention, as youth are eager to play them, and they can be easily distributed to a large audience, extending the reach of the intervention. In addition, video games motivate youth to repeatedly practice new skills, enhancing the effectiveness through motivation. Moreover, video games can evoke powerful emotions and can include complex social interactions, allowing us to provide youth with effective content. However, this model is largely untested. Therefore, I aim to answer the questions: can we create motivating games that prevent depression with effective content? And do youth actually want to play a game when it's not just for fun, but it's also good for them? Playing a video game for fun may be far more enticing to youth than playing a game that is aimed at their mental health. We could invest a lot of time and energy in developing games that can effectively prevent depression, but if these games do not appeal to youth or are not presented in a way that appeals to youth, we may not be able to reach all of those who could benefit. Thus, it is important to study if youth would be interested in mental health games, when they can also play the newest blockbuster entertainment games. In addition, we need to understand how we can best promote mental health games. To explore this, I performed 2 experiments, in which I compared youth reaction to trailers which introduced the same commercial game as a regular entertainment game or a mental health game. In the first experiment, all participants were shown one of the 2 trailers before they played the game, leading participants to believe they were playing a mental health or an entertainment game. Promisingly, all participants were highly intrinsically motivated, regardless of which trailer they had seen. However, participants who were under the impression that they had played a mental health game reported feeling less autonomy in the game. and those who also had higher depressive symptoms felt less competent in the game. As these experiences may result in youth not choosing to play a mental health game, we performed a second experiment in which we gave young adults at risk for mental health issues an active choice. More precisely, we carefully designed 2 trailers for one commercial game, creating the illusion that participants could choose to play either a mental health or an entertainment game. Interestingly, the results showed that participants were more likely to select the game when it was promoted with a mental health message. In contrast to the results of the first experiment, participants who thought they were playing a mental health game had more severe mental health symptoms experienced more autonomy in the game. This may be explained by the active choice participants had in the second experiment, which may counteract any sense that their autonomy was being limited. So, if we can create effective depression prevention games, these experiments indicate that youth at risk do find these games appealing and would want to play a game to improve their mental health, allowing us to reach many more youth with depression prevention. However, that still leaves the questions: can we create games that effectively prevent depression? And does playing these games motivate youth in a way that promotes effectiveness? Finding games that prevent depression can be approached from 2 sides. We can create games based on existing therapies, games with an applied purpose. Or we can examine commercial games that players believe benefit their mental health and which we can link to cognitive and behavioral processes that research suggests help prevent depression. We tested both these approaches among youth with depressive symptoms and tracked their depressive symptoms across the intervention period and the year that followed. In the first trial, we compared Sparks, a fantasy game based on cognitive behavioral therapy, to Op Volle Kracht, a group-based program also based on cognitive behavioral therapy. In addition, we compared Sparks to a combination of the 2 programs, and to a group that received no program and only filled in some questionnaires. On average, participants decreased in their depressive symptoms across the study. However, there was no difference between the 4 groups of participants in the extent to which their depressive symptoms decreased. Thus, both participants playing Sparks and participants in the group program were equally well off as participants who had only filled out some weekly questionnaires. In addition, we examined if youth who played Sparks were more motivated for the intervention than participants who did not play the game. Interestingly, there were no absolute differences in the motivation of participants between the different groups. Therefore, we also tested the effects of the popular commercial game Journey. Although this game was not designed to prevent depression, based on player experiences and the content of the game, we expected that it could prevent depression through making players, for example, more hopeful, as players repeatedly overcome difficult obstacles. We compared youth playing Journey to youth playing Flower, a game from the same designers, but which we did not expect to prevent depression, and a group of youth who did not play a game. Again, we saw that youth in the depression prevention trial showed the same average decrease in depressive symptoms over time in all 3 of the participant groups. And Journey did not show the expected effects on the depression prevention mechanisms. Furthermore, while youth were more motivated and engaged by Journey, this was not sufficient to influence their depressive symptoms. Thus, Journey did not prevent depression in the way we had expected. However, by examining all participants together, we could examine the nature of the decrease in depressive symptoms over time. This showed that youth's decrease in depressive symptoms was associated with several of the depression prevention mechanisms we had examined. For example, youth who became more hopeful across the study showed a bigger decrease in depressive symptoms compared to youth who did not become more hopeful. Therefore, the results did illuminate potential targets for future depression prevention games. Thus, the studies in my dissertation indicate that youth are drawn to and motivated by the idea of a game that can benefit their mental health. And while we identified several mechanisms that may be targeted by depression prevention video games, we did not find either Sparks or Journey to effectively prevent depression. However, neither game made full use of the affordances of video games. Therefore, I suggest that while it is challenging, if we can integrate the active therapeutic content into the engaging aspects of video games, we may be able to create immersive game experiences in which youth can practice skills that make them less susceptible to depression. Having presented a summary of my thesis, I return the floor to you, Rector.
Thank you very much for this clear summary of your research. We now proceed with the defense of your thesis, with which I wish you every success. I would like to begin by giving the floor to Professor Otten from Radboud University, who's also served as chair of the Manuscript Committee.
Thank you. Dear candidate, dear Marlou, first I would like to congratulate you and your supervisors, but mostly you, of course, on this magnificent performance. Your dissertation is a very elaborated and strong work, and at the same time it is easy to read and a very good example of how research furthers our knowledge on new innovative ways to improve prevention and treatment of mental health problems. In this particular case, you look at the effectiveness and appeal of applied and commercial games, which is innovative in itself, but also comes along with tons of questions that are new to us. I think this research answers some important questions, such as how we should present and promote therapeutic games. But it gives us also much food for thought and difficult issues that we should get our teeth into. And I think that is what research is all about. I really enjoyed our conversations on research and this one particular paper that will surely find a nice outlet, but first things first, right? So I do have some questions or thoughts that I would like to share with you. My first question is all about time specificity and subgroups on a macro and micro level. First, on a macro level, looking at the effectiveness of both Sparks and Journey, you find no heightened effectiveness in comparison to other groups included in the study. Considering the fact that you used non-clinical samples and the fact that depressive symptoms and mood do fluctuate over time, do you think that you used the appropriate screening strategy? Sure, the participants all show elevated levels of symptoms, but whether a questionnaire does provide a reliable picture, well, that's debatable, right? This may just be a snapshot, in particular in this specific age group. Of course, I do understand that it's very hard to form a stable baseline in such a large study. That would be impossible. Also, research on LSPEC data on a sample of 14,000 adolescents published in 2019 by Kwong and colleagues showed that adolescents follow different trajectories of depressive symptoms, starting at age 11 and increasing over time until the age of 20, when they plateaued and start to decrease for both boys and girls. Interestingly, it also showed that females show a peak velocity at age 13.5. So again, in the light of these findings, I was wondering, what are we looking at? Could it be that your sample is contaminated with mostly girls that find themselves on completely different developmental trajectories of depressive symptoms, which may actually explain your findings, right? And then on a micro level, in the discussion part on page 2005, you mentioned the fact that we still learn more about the nature of depression and its cause. You mentioned the work of Bosboom and Fried, for instance, and now by mentioning these researchers and their work, you also hint towards a certain research design, but also at the dynamic nature of what we are looking at here. Again, research has shown that depressive symptoms fluctuate over time and even across the day. While people with depression or depressive symptoms can experience severe lows at any point during the day, many experience worse symptoms in the morning. How could this affect your findings? I am curious to learn more about your thoughts. And maybe most importantly, I guess I'm just afraid that we draw conclusions and then we just throw the baby out with the bathwater. And I don't think that's a good thing. So.
Honest sir, thank you for your compliments. I agree that there is definitely some issues with screening strategies and that can severely influence our results and the conclusions that we draw. Specifically, I tried using two different screening techniques, slightly different screening techniques in these two RCTs. So with Sparks, we did a single depression symptom questionnaire. And we indeed saw that right after they had filled in the screening questionnaire and once they were included in the study, their depressive symptoms just plummeted, which would suggest that there can be actually many explanations for why that could happen. And one of the big ones is that we might not be including the right sample. Perhaps youth who are experiencing a bad day the moment that we have that questionnaire, and I've anecdotal experience with giving these questionnaires to the youth and them being in completely different moods. And I think for all of us, it's difficult to reflect on how we've been feeling over the past 2 weeks, and especially if your mood at the moment is quite strong, either happy or sad, that could affect how you are reporting, and therefore it could be that we're actually including a lot of girls in here that are sad at the moment and maybe have some experience with negative mood in the past 2 weeks, but that are not in need of a prevention program. And also maybe missing a lot of youth who are actually not reporting on it at that specific moment. We tried to be a bit more strict in the second RCT by also assessing core depressive symptoms with a second assessment, hoping to sort of get a little bit of a better sense that it wasn't just sort of peripheral depressive symptoms that were leading them to be scoring high on the SUMP score, basically. But that, again, resulted in the same steep drop-off of symptoms.
So could it be a reflection of the drop that we see in more this longitudinal study that I spoke about? Could it be that in general everybody drops in depressive symptoms over time?
Yes, definitely. Yeah, we basically do have a lot of indication that youth and everyone, that depressive symptoms go down over time. So this is, of course, a really small time span. So there was a week, maybe a couple weeks between these two questionnaires. So I personally would lean a bit more to sort of the micro level effects that would be influencing them in the moment, resulting in that drop.
Would that also mean that you would use this more micro level approach to develop a new screening method, or?
I think that that definitely has a lot of potential. It does have a lot of practical issues. Getting the sample to fill out the questionnaire once was already quite the challenge. So getting them to fill in repeated questionnaires might be quite hard, but I do think that would make our results much more valid.
So how would you do that?
Well, one option would be to use ecological sampling. So just basically get them to answer the same question several times a day over an extended period of time to get a sense of how their symptoms are progressing, if it is just certain peaks and they were recovering really quickly from negative mood, or people taking much more longer to recover from, for example, negative events. There's some indication that those might be the ones that are most at risk.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much.
Okay.
I now give the floor to Professor Bowman from Texas Tech University in the United States.
Okay. Thank you for having me here. And I wanted to note, as I was flying over, I was reading this on the plane, and it was quite the discussion starter. And I point that out because a common reaction we get, I think, from the public at large, games are toys, and that's it.
Yeah.
Right? For 60 years, they've entertained our children. They've gotten us in trouble at school when we've not done our homework, or there's concerns that we're going to hit each other after we play. And the reason I point that out is I think you've done something in your work that's very powerful. And you're speaking to the potential of the mundane, right? So as you mentioned yourself, we know that 10 to 25% of youth suffer depression in some way. We know that even the most effective treatments, as you've outlined in your thesis, are not very effective. And we know that kids spend a lot of time playing video games. So you can imagine the parents around me were like, oh, what do you mean video games and depression prevention? That's not right. It must have caused depression. I said, well, actually, there's a lot more to this. So I got to have a fun conversation with my seatmates about your dissertation, and it was fun. I wish you could have been there. It was nice. But I say this because it speaks to research that is starting to unpack the things that are around us every day that we may not give enough attention to. You even write in other parts of your thesis that we're not really seeing games that are developed for depression prevention at the scale level, but Journey, just a regular entertainment game, was one of the most popular games of the early half of the 21st century. We know they're playing, we know they're engaged, and I think you're hitting at something now where how do we take this thing that we're doing for lots of reasons and move past it just being a toy, and maybe give the medium a bit more respect for the role it plays in our lives, maybe elevating it to the ways we talk about the complex relationship we have with film or with books or with television, that games arrive there. And the fact that we're all sitting in this room right now listening to your thesis on the role that games play in depression prevention, that's a nice cap on where we're going with this. So I congratulate you on that for the impromptu public outreach. I have a feeling that more people are going to want to read this. And while your findings may not have always pointed in the direction you were hoping they would go, you and your team have done an amazing job of pointing us into the direction of where we should go as scholars, right? No one study answers the questions. I giggled to myself when I was reading through your studies and your findings and you were trying to explain some of the results, and there's a career in here. Right? There's still lots of pages that haven't been written yet, and I hope you see that. I saw it and I got a little jealous. I wish I could go back and do some of this as well. So thank you very much for that. And a final note, I wrote in my notes here that when I was reading through your scholarship, I noticed that you had found your apple. You had found your object of desire. I want to understand the role that games play in violence and depression prevention. But you were able to slice it in lots of different ways. And what I mean by that is so many scholars, we learn one method, and we learn one idea, and we just rinse and repeat, and we do that until we are no longer doing it. And your experiments, your longitudinal analyses, the many different ways that you analyze the data in here, in some ways it's a clinic on how to think about problems with different mindsets and different perspectives. And even one experiment is not the same from experiment to experiment. So I really appreciated this. Okay. With that being said, my background is media psychology and entertainment studies. I had to explain to my parents that I study entertainment for a living. And I'm not to ask them for money, and I'm 40, so we're on a good track so far. When I read your book, and when I read listen to your presentation, you do talk about kids are already playing video games. And what I was wondering is the extent to which you would look towards the entertainment reactions. So something I was noticing in your experimental designs, very strong attention to independent variables and what are we doing to manipulate the things that different children are getting so that we can see if the outcomes are happening, we can attribute it to those games. You looked at depressive symptoms and related dependent variables, the object of focus for your thesis. I think what I was looking for, though, was what I might call the throughput. And it's how are they absorbing the game as an entertainment experience, whether that's enjoyment, fun, pleasure, arousal, or whether that's appreciation, pensiveness, eudaimonia, this deeper reflection. I had wrote a note in your dissertation where you talked a bit about, that games can evoke specific emotions. And I was hoping to hear more about that. I was hoping to hear, it wasn't really a measure in many of your studies. But when I look at eudaimonia and the idea of that pensive self-reflection that one has towards a mediated experience. So in film, we can look at a film like Hotel Rwanda or Schindler's List, and you watch this film and it's going to engage you at a much deeper level. I wondered if that could play a role in your line of research. So whether that's what you would do differently if you were going to measure entertainment outcomes, again, reinforcing the idea that many of your games are games you buy off the shelf. Or related to that, is there reason to believe that some of your variants could be captured and how different children and different adolescents were processing the messages that they were seeing, as opposed to just showing the messages, measuring the outcomes, making the comparisons. And a lot of times in science, we call it the black box. We don't know what happened in the middle. How could you speak to that?
All right, sir, thank you for all of your compliments. I think this is very fascinating to look at it indeed from that entertainment perspective, and I think especially that eudaimonia, which you were talking about, and that sort of meaning making was also aspect of why we selected Journey as a potential game to prevent depression, because it has that really underlying narrative of going through ups and downs and overcoming obstacles, but it is a very implicit narrative. So you could go through that entire game and just think, okay, at some point some monsters attacked me, and not get that much from it. But when I was piloting the RCT, I also had some youth talk to them about their experience. And for example, one of them talking about an experience in the game where you're walking up a mountain and you're thrown back by the storm that is brewing there, and them having to get back up and persevere, and them relating that to the school grades they were getting and how they kept having to get themselves motivated again to keep going because they kept failing. But that is, I think, a reflection that not everyone has. And not everyone experiences that way. Not everyone will be able to make that link on their own, maybe need more reflection. So I do think that is a very interesting aspect that could explain why people online were saying, hey, Journey helped me get through these, through grief, through depression. And while when we just gave it to youth to play, that it might not have happened, or at least not in enough degree that we could see that on an RCT level. So I think it would be very interesting to also research that aspect, but I think we would need more qualitative work than what I've been doing. Right,
and that was actually my follow-up is, so it's a great answer, and you know, for example, when you showed that hope moderated some of your effects. Hope ties in very carefully to eudaimonia and reflection. You know, that when you leave an experience and you actually feel a bit of inspiration, it makes sense that you would process the experience differently. So with that in mind, and knowing that at least in media psychology, we're seeing research move very quickly in this direction. Dr. Konijn on the call is very familiar with this research. And so I wonder, and this is the classic defense question, you know, and I wouldn't ask if you're going to do it again because you didn't do anything wrong. But as you're looking towards your career and you're looking towards this possibility, what types of designs could you use that might unpack that variable, that might speak to whether it's, you know, you kind of hinted at contextualization, and you kind of did that in your trailers, right? What could you do if you wanted to capture that eudaimonia and its role in the effect of not just giving somebody these video games, but understanding how they're unpacking it and then looking at the depressive symptoms outwards?
Yeah, I think we would have to go into that qualitative direction to really understand why youth are picking up certain games, what kind of messages they are internalizing from that game. For example, with focus groups, to have to talk, for example, also talk out loud while they're playing the game to get really an idea of what they're saying throughout the game, because your reflection afterwards might also be different from what you're experiencing during the game. And that way we might also be able to link what they're saying during the game towards how they're processing that afterwards. Also, I think what you were hinting on about with the contextualization, I think it's really important to see how they're picking up the game. So what we did now is we just gave them the games, and this is what you're playing because it's an RCT, you're randomized, you're supposed to do this. But that's not at all the experience that youth normally have, of course. They pick up a game because they've heard about it from their friends, because they've seen about it, and that's why they're picking it up. And that can also be really strong. Your expectations beforehand about the game could also be influencing how you're experiencing it and how that then influences your depressive symptoms after.
Right. Thank you so much. I appreciate your answers.
Thank you.
I would now like to give the floor to Professor Konijn from the Vrije Universiteit in Amsterdam, who's joining this defense on the video platform Zoom.
We cannot hear you.
We can't hear you.
Sorry, I'm still muted. Sorry for that.
Well, welcome back.
Dear candidate, dear Marlou, first of all, of course, I'd like to congratulate you with this very impressive piece of work in such a beautifully designed book. But given the time, I'll leave my words of praise. I confine to all of the words that have been spoken by my colleagues. And I'll move on to my question right away that goes into a little bit of a different direction than we just heard. Especially about chapter 6. I would like to hear your thoughts and reflections on the results. You designed very well and neatly conducted studies, and therefore the results were a little surprising that no difference have been found between the 4 treatment conditions. To reiterate for the audience, the 4 conditions or the groups are the school-based intervention, opvolle kracht or OVK, the game-like intervention sparks, the 3rd condition combining OVK and sparks, and the 4th condition only having questionnaires. In particular, it's remarkable that even the group with just questionnaires or the questionnaires only condition, that even this group without any specific treatment showed a decrease in depression over time. And the decrease in depression over time was similar to the other groups with treatment. At page 144, you discuss several possible explanations for these findings. On the one hand, you argue that the mere effect of just getting attention in the group with only questionnaires through emails, reminders and things like that just getting attention might have therapeutic effects and may already be sufficient to decrease depression over time. On the other hand, you argue that just filling out the weekly questionnaires may have instigated reflections that helped to overcome the depressed symptoms. If I combine this with your literature review on page 14 of your introduction, where you state that most who suffer from depression recover within a year, then it raises 2 questions. 1. Taken together, why would we put time and effort in developing a sophisticated video game if such simple methods of giving attention and passing of time already would help overcoming depression in youth? And my second question, in regards of the assumed self-monitoring effect in the questionnaire-only group, have studies been done to compare with a real control group, that is, a group not receiving any treatment at all? That means also no attention by weekly questionnaires.
Dear
I'm
Madam,
curious to your answers.
Honored Madam, thank you for your compliments. I think there have been indeed studies looking at that self-monitoring effect, but comparing that to not getting any research questions at all is of course really, really difficult, because in order to study that you would be giving them some sort of questionnaires and that could already be affecting them. So the research context can be explaining a lot of this effect. But what I would also like to go into is it then necessary to put all this effort into developing programs, games that can help them with their depressive symptoms, when maybe this is enough, just letting them track their symptoms, maybe that sort of destigmatizing effect of like, there is research being done on this isn't weird to be feeling this, and then they can get support from their environment. But I think, on the other hand, the research also shows that depression is a really, really serious problem, and especially for these young people when it occurs so early on in their development, that maybe even delaying that onset of the disorder would already be very beneficial. So I certainly think that it is something we should look into, whether we can indeed spread out these kinds of effects to the larger population of indeed self-monitoring or giving them a bit of extra attention on mental health symptoms. But I do not think that it is enough to really address the big problem that there is. And I think even though it does get better with time, we also know that people who have had a depressive episode before are much more likely to experience a depressive episode again later in life. The more you've had, the more likely you are to have it again. So I do think there's a lot to be done, even if we can just shorten that period in which you're feeling depressed. So yeah, I do think we need to keep developing. Oh.
Professor Konijn, we can't hear you. We can't hear you.
You're muted again.
Techniques, sorry. Indeed, your answer is in a way reflected in your results. If I look at figure 2, perhaps it helps to show it in this way. Because indeed, after your 12-month follow-up study, you see at the end that in the 3 groups with the treatment, the 3 treatment group, or the 2 treatment groups and the control group, they increase in depression at the end, so after a year of after the start of the treatment. However, what speaks in favor of your study aim is the red line, and that's reflecting the group that played Sparks. Yes, so in favor of your study aim is that in the 12th month follow-up of the group playing Sparks, they still show a quite low level of depression, whereas the others all show clear increases. I don't know whether this momentary comparison would be significant. It's not reported in your chapter. And I'm very much curious why you don't report on this specific finding that might even hint to some of the effective parts of playing violent video games. Because apparently the Sparks players did learn something that helped them to overcome depression symptoms a year later. You don't mention this in your dissertation. I'd very much like to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I was being careful and trying to be statistically correct in the fact that there was at that point also no difference between the groups. It's hard to say if this is like a temporary, accidental thing that they are at that point seemingly sort of at a trend level a little bit lower than the other groups, or would that have persevered if we would have checked them again 6 months later? Would they again be showing that they're showing lower depressive symptoms and maybe something is sticking that they learn in the game? In that situation, I would be very interested in what is happening in the group that combined the 2 programs, because is it then too much for them? Did they get confusing messages, for example? Or is this really just accidental, just chance finding, basically, that there is that it appears that they're scoring a bit lower? But if that is the situation, that they do have a sustained effect, then yeah, then that would be very promising indeed.
But did you do any analysis just for the group differences on that moment? Because yes. I read only the trend analysis.
Yeah, we did also look at just specifically moment to moment. I think it is reported in one of the tables, but it's one of the more the analysis we started with, that we just looked at each moment. Was there a difference between the time? So see if I can quickly find it. Yeah, it's table 2 on page 139. So there we see that at T12, so that's the 12-month follow-up, that the F is 1.57, and that is not a significant value there. But you do indeed see that it is closer to a significant value than what we're seeing in most of the effects. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Very interesting. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I would now like to invite Dr. Stikkelbroek from the University of Utrecht.
Thank you. I want to compliment you with your thesis, your fine thesis. Maybe you know I'm more a clinician. My work is as a clinician, and when I saw the thesis, I was filled with joy. I thought, oh, gaming and depression, where I'm treating depressed adolescents every day. So. And you state in your introduction, exciting possibilities to move beyond traditional depression prevention lie in the growing digitalization of mental health care. And I think you really have a very important issue here. So, but then I read the results, and maybe they are a little bit depressing because you don't find it. I want to elaborate with you on that, what we can do to more understand what is happening there. And maybe also you saw the meta-analysis from WISE in 2019 when you were conducting the research still. Yeah. And you saw that he also acknowledged that the effectiveness of prevention was going down instead of up after all the work we have done. So it's still very, very useful to explore this kind of work with digital interventions. What I wanted to discuss with you is that you really looked into the screening, as discussed earlier, and you looked at people scored above a certain level, and but I did not see that you looked at the people who are maybe really have a diagnosis, and you did not. I could not find in both RCTs that you rejected them as an exclusion criteria. And I thought, well, in what way could that have been influencing your results? Because you were really treating depressed adolescents. That's one question. The other one is that we are talking about prevention, but if we look at the outcome, we are looking at treatment because they have really elevated levels of symptoms. You are looking at trying to get them down, but maybe you are really treating them because if you really wanted to know if the chance of developing a depression went down, you really should look at another outcome, I think. So I would like to, if you could comment on that. Yeah.
Honored, madam. Thank you for the compliments. Yeah, we did not have an upper cutoff to exclude youth who may have actually had a diagnosable disorder. This was basically very practical that we didn't want to exclude that group. Also following a lot of prevention RCTs, you see that sometimes clinical interviews are given, and then sometimes they do exclude people who are diagnosable. But actually, with indicated prevention, this is the common way to do it. That doesn't mean that it's the right way to do it, but that is what we followed. On the one hand, I would find it very interesting that group then would also be so easy to bring down actually in their symptoms. But sorry, could you repeat?
Yeah, do you think that if you have a level of a certain amount of adolescents who would be really diagnosed with a depression disorder, mm-hmm. How did that influence your outcome? What would it mean? And
yeah, so there was a colleague who continued working with the SPARCS data, and she actually also looked at what kind of groups there were in symptom development, and there was also what we see in a lot of depression work, that there was one group of adolescents who were scoring very high and remained very high. So perhaps that is that group that is diagnosable and keeps keeps elevated symptoms throughout. And for that group, potentially sparks or what we were trying to give them was not enough. They might have needed more individual treatment, which could have masked an effect, especially if we're going back towards also saying that there might have been kids in there that actually were not having depressive symptoms. So then we're getting a very heterogeneous group of youth that we would not expect the same response for the treatment. Exactly. So I think actually there's a lot of work to be done in how do we identify who we want to provide prevention to before we can really talk about the effectiveness of prevention.
Okay. And how do you think about measuring the decrease of symptoms as a measure for prevention?
Yeah, so there is literature indeed stating that that what we would call a prevention effect is if the control group were either were basically going up in symptoms, because that is what you would theoretically expect. This is a group at high risk, so their depressive symptoms would rise over time, and you would be successful if you either get the treatment group to stay stable or even decrease a little, but particularly if that control group is going up in symptoms. We almost never find that. That is almost never shown in the literature. And I think it might also be a little bit of a naive way of looking at these elevated symptoms, because we think about it, we try to imagine what is a youth like that is just about to enter depressive episodes. They are having already some symptoms, they're doing bad. But if you're just looking at the symptoms, you could also be looking at someone who is actually just about to get out of their depressive episode and are doing better. So you don't know where that, just the score, it doesn't tell you where that child is at the moment.
Yeah. Thank you very much for your answer. Very good.
The final person, final member of the promotion committee to be given the floor is Dr. Maartje Luijten from Radboud University.
Thank you. So, dear candidate, sorry. First of all, I would like to congratulate you on a very impressive, highly interesting and very well-written thesis, and I would like to extend my congratulations to your supervision team. I very much like the combination of the experimental studies and the RCTs included in your thesis, and it hasn't been said today, but this must have been a lot of work. But that's how we know you. I would say that Perseverance and Marlou are almost the same. I am deeply impressed by how you persevered in finishing your thesis without ever considering to lower the bar in terms of quantity or quality of your output. So very well done. And I would like to give you one more compliment. Having known you as a colleague, I know that your cooking in our writing weeks was always so amazing, and we still use your recipes for Christmas in my family, so also thank you for that. But having said all of this, you know, the science is not your only quality, we know. I, of course, do have some questions related to the content of your studies. In your thesis, you basically have the RCTs, but you also did the experimental studies about how to frame the video games to youth. And having those studies in mind, I was looking in chapter 7 about the journey, and then I was wondering how you actually framed journey to your participants, and how did you frame the control game. And you know, I'm not sure whether you had all the results in place when you designed chapter 7, but if you would have known all the results of your earlier chapters, what do you think would have been the best way to frame journey to your participants, and why? So that would be my first question.
Honored Madam, thank you for your compliments, also about my cooking. We did have at least initial results of the experiments, and we did actually, what we were trying to do at that point was actually equalize expectations while they were going in. So we did show the youth trailers for both Journey and Flower prior to starting, prior to even being randomized actually. And we then included I wouldn't say it was a very explicit mental health message, but there were some sort of hints towards mental health benefits. But that were trying to be equal across both Journey and Flower, to sort of start with equal expectations of the game, because we were trying to give both games an honest chance, basically. But I think if we're really trying to get the best prevention effect, I do think we could experiment with giving that explicit message to see whether they would actually, actually pick up on more of the potential mental health mechanisms in the game, would be more open to those, and perhaps. When we're talking about reflecting on the messages in the game, they would be more open to those if they have that message beforehand. So I would be really interested to study that. And actually, an equals colleague of mine also looked at that a bit with the game Mindlight, providing 2 trailers beforehand with a mental health message and with an entertainment message. But she primarily looked at like how they interacted with the game, not a long-term outcome. And of course, that's a difficult comparison as well, because how our comparison was slightly challenging because it was an entertainment game and we just gave the messaging beforehand. Within Mindlight, the mental health messaging is of course already there because it was really designed to be an applied game. So that's not entirely a fair comparison.
So in that way, if I understand you correctly, you actually did not get the full potential of Journey in your study because the framing was a little bit into the direction of mental health, but if you would have to do it again and you would try to maximize the potential, you would increase that message and help the participants a little bit to go into this mindset of overcoming your struggles.
Yeah, I think that we know that expectation is a really important aspect. So if we can capitalize on that and make them more open to that experience, why not?
Okay, because in your experimental studies, you observed that about 2/3 of the participants selected the game that was framed as having mental health benefits. But that also means that there is still a substantial amount of individuals who would not prefer, the framing in that way. So do you have ideas on how to reach those remaining participants, or how would you investigate individual differences and maybe even apply that in a new study or in a clinical setting, if you would like to go more into this individualization?
Yes. So I would first like to do more experiments and perhaps also have a qualitative aspect in those experiments to talk to the youth who didn't select a game to understand why they didn't. Because, for example, we did have a few open-ended questions afterwards to see why they had selected the game, and those were very brief answers, but those ranged from everything to them being like, well, it made me feel like something was wrong with me if I chose that game. Yeah. So it's really kind of like a stigmatizing thing. And if that is your view of mental health games, then I would say perhaps we would go with the stealth message and sort of hide the fact that we're trying to help them. Although we have to consider ethical reasons there as well. But there was also young adults who were saying that they didn't feel bad at that moment. So perhaps if in the moment they were feeling down, they might have selected the game. So perhaps it also is for some of them to do with timing, or we saw a very big effect as well of the design of the trailers. So a lot of the youth who selected the entertainment trailer did so when it was in the more desirable trailer. We hadn't intended to have a difference between the 2 trailers in terms of design, but when the entertainment message was in the trailer that they found more attractive overall, we did see that they chose that game more. So I think that also leads us to conclude that we really have to focus on design as well and making the games engaging in order for them to choose it.
Yeah, so this all points to how complex it is when you, in the end, want to help individuals instead of the big RCTs where you look at the group effects. But yeah, so thank you very much for your answers, and I would like to give the word back to the rector.
Well, each member of the promotion committee has now had the opportunity to raise one question, and we have some time left, so I would like to invite our guest from the United States, perhaps to ask a second and third question.
Sure. So I've written several more during the presentation because you really have me thinking. And something you mentioned, I want to go back to journey and go back to contextualization and some of these other conversations around the game. So I keep thinking of the idea of procedural rhetoric, and I'm not sure how familiar you are with this concept. It's the notion that you can embed lessons within game mechanics. So you see it a lot in serious games for learning. So a really good example is a game called My Cotton Pickin' Life about Azerbaijani child labor, where children go into the fields, they pick cotton, and you have to pick so much cotton in a day to win. Now what you learn very quickly as you try to pick this cotton off the plants is you don't get very much credit for it. That is the lesson. It is tedious, dangerous, uninspiring labor. And you're not supposed to win. You're supposed to give up eventually, and then the game teaches you. Like, now, you were on your desk with a computer mouse picking cotton. Now imagine what it was like to be out there. Journey is interesting, because as you said yourself, there's a metaphor there. But oftentimes in procedural rhetoric, it's not a metaphor. Or maybe it is. And this connects to another notion called the disorienting dilemma. When you give somebody an experience, I mentioned it in my earlier question, that is meant to unsettle them. We see that games are becoming more mature as a medium, right? And it's not uncommon to see games like That Dragon Cancer, where you play a game where your child dies of cancer, and your job is to experience and cope with this. And these games are doing surprisingly well, critically, economically. Do you see a future for games, and to a final note you've mentioned about stigma, maybe ancillary benefits, that maybe if the games aren't even that successful at depression, impact, maybe it's phasic, and so we know we go through cycles, but it gets us thinking about it and talking about it. All of these things to me point to the possibility of games that directly attack depression, show us that it's okay, and show us how to recognize it. I'm wondering how that plays a role in or off of your thesis research. Like, what do you think you could tell folks who are looking to get into games that might more, journey's metaphorical, but journey except that you are fighting depression, and depression's in the video game. Can you speak to that? And maybe whether your data can, whether your own research agenda can, or whether your theories can, can those concepts of disorienting dilemmas and procedural rhetorics, can they play a role in your line of research moving forward? And if so, what do you think you would do to make the next steps to get into that? How is the player processing the information?
Yeah, I agree that the video games are maturing, and they are exploring more complex topics, and they're not just for fun and being that hero that is untouchable and that always wins the game. So we have come to a place where we can start exploring more difficult topics, and I think the fact that youth were mostly open to that explicit mental health messaging may also mean that we can go a little further in not making it more metaphoric, but making it a little bit more clear. But I do think we have to be careful then not to go into the too didactic part, where it still is a emotional experience, it still is a narrative that you're going into, because I think that those are the affordances of video games that are so promising. Because we also know from the literature that when people experience relevant emotions during therapy, that they are more successful in overcoming their symptoms. So, but also it can talk to destigmatization, so that if people learn more about it, that it is that it is okay to experience depression, and that, yeah.
Thank you very much.
The defense is hereby concluded. I give the floor once again to the candidate.
Having defended my dissertation to the best of my ability, I would like to thank the rector and my supervisors, as well as all of those who have honored this ceremony with their presence.
Well, we're going to adjourn this meeting now for some 20 minutes, I guess, and the committee will retreat for its deliberations.
Meenemen. Nee?
The Council of Deans of Radboud University has decided to award you the degree of doctor. I invite the promoter, Professor Lichtwarck-Aschoff, to fulfill the task assigned to her.
In the name of the Lord, with the power entrusted by law of the Doctorate Board, I hereby confer upon you, Marlou Poppelaars, born in Ede, the title of doctor from Radboud University, Nijmegen, to which are attached all the associated legal and customary rights and duties with respect to academia and society. As proof thereof, I present you with this doctoral diploma, signed by the rector and the doctoral thesis supervisor.
Well, Professor Lichtwarck will now also address you in Laudatio, and we can all be seated.
I understand.
Ja, you can stand.
Nou, beste dokter Poppelaars, beste Marlou. Ik zal dat nu in het Nederlands doen, want dit is echt Marlou's feestje. Nu is alles gedaan en zij wil het graag in het Nederlands hebben. Hier staan we dan nu. Ik vind het ontzettend leuk dat ik hier mag staan om je toe te spreken. En om je als eerste te mogen feliciteren met deze onwijs knappe prestatie. En weet je wat het leukste is? Ik draag de toga van Isabela. Dus ze is hier toch echt een beetje bij, behalve alleen maar op het scherm. Wij twee gaan samen way back in time. Gisteren zei mijn jongste zoon nog, wat? Ken je echt al langer dan ik oud ben? Hij is 8. En ja, dat klopt. Wij werken al bijna 9 jaar om precies te zijn samen. Je hebt namelijk ook de Research Master bij mij gedaan. Je was een van mijn allereerste Research Master studenten in Nijmegen, hier in het jaar 2012-2013. Dus ik heb echt het pad mogen volgen van een jonge student tot een volwassen wetenschapper. En dan leer je elkaar wel een beetje kennen. Wie me een beetje kent, weet het. Ik heb om een verhaal te houden altijd een clue nodig, een symbool, een analogie. Iets wat me inspireert en wat past bij de persoon en de gelegenheid. Bij jou kwam gelijk iets bij me op. Stille wateren hebben diepe gronden. En het is hier dit flesje, het water in jouw lievelingskleur. Ik zet dit hier maar even neer. Ik vind dit spreekwoord heel mooi passend bij jou. Ik zou zo nu en dan zeggen waarom ik dat denk. Maar nu eerst weer terug naar het begin. In 2012-2013 had je dus je Research Master project bij mij en Rutger Engels gedaan. Deze studie, de studie waarin op volle kracht vergeleken met Spark, zit ook in je proefschrift. Na de afronden van je Research Master project ging ik met zwangerschapsverlof, met die jongste dus. En toen ik terugkwam had je inmiddels een BSc PhD-plek veroverd. Dat had ik nog net even meegekregen. Die je samen met Marlou's Kleinjan en Isabela Granic, Rutger weet ik niet meer helemaal zeker, als begeleidingsteam vorm zou geven. Ik moet wel bekennen dat toen ik terugkwam dacht ik, wat? Nee hè, waarom ben ik er niet bij betrokken? Andere studenten prima, maar niet Marlou, die niet, die wil ik. Nou, de tijd verging, life happened en Rutger Engels en Marlou's Kleinjan, die vertrokken naar Utrecht naar het Trimbos Instituut. En daarmee ook als begeleiders van jouw project. En zo kwam ik weer in de picture. Heel blij en gelukkig natuurlijk dat ik toch weer met jou verder zou samen kunnen werken. Nou, en wat heb je, en dat is door de commissie ook heel duidelijk opgemerkt, wat heb je aan bergen aan werk gezet. Naast die grote OVK-Spark-studie heb je dan vervolgens een grote randomized control trial opgezet en uitgevoerd, Journey Flowers trial. Deze keer met 3 arms. Maar niet alleen dat, daarnaast ook nog de experimentele studies rondom het effect van messaging. Daarnaast ook nog een aantal projecten die niet in de proefschrift zitten. Zoals bijvoorbeeld het project met Rieneke of de screening drop paper met Roy. Die er nog niet is, maar wel komt. Maar ook projecten waar we uiteindelijk weer mee gestopt zijn. Daar denk ik bijvoorbeeld aan Hamdi. Ja, in 10 jaar tijd dan maak je aardig wat samen mee. Hordes aan studenten gecoördineerd en begeleid. Een compliance rate van deelnemers in je studies, dat betekent de mensen die blijven meedoen in de studie en niet afvallen. En we hebben het hier dus over adolescenten, hè, die kampen met depressieve symptomen. Dus die vaak lusteloos zijn, zonder energie, zonder motivatie. En die compliance rates van jou, die waren zo hoog dat je daar echt u tegen zegt. Hè. Dus je had al die ballen, die bleef je in de lucht houden, allemaal. On top of things, altijd, tot in elk detail. Nu ook, hè. Ah, tabel even die pagina, dan denk ik, wat? Zonder daarbij hysterisch over de gangen te rennen. Nee, rustig, gecontroleerd en doordacht. Stille wateren hebben diepe gronden. En die bergen, en dan heb ik het echt over bergen aan data. Die moesten natuurlijk allemaal veilig en goed gemanaged opgeslagen worden. En oh, wat kon ik daar veel van je leren. Eén en al organisatie. Met veel jaloezie heb ik soms naar die orde in al je mappen en documenten gekeken. Perfecte uitgangsbasis natuurlijk om goed de analyses te kunnen doen. En Marlou die zoekt het uit. Allemaal, echt allemaal, tot op het bodem. Verschillende en complexe analyses gedaan is hier ook ter sprake gebracht. Elke keer weer opnieuw andere data, andere uitdaging, veel geleerd, analytisch sterk. Snel in opnemen en uitzoeken van nieuwe dingen, hulp inschakelen waar nodig. Weer moeiteloos, rustig, gestructureerd, geen gezeur. Stille wateren hebben diepe gronden. Analyses gedaan, resultaten bekeken. Dan heb je dus een paar antwoorden, maar vooral heb je ook weer heel veel nieuwe vragen. Vooral als je nulbevindingen hebt. Wat betekent het allemaal? Wat weten we nou? Wat kunnen we wel en niet zeggen? Moet het opgeschreven worden, gepubliceerd en gepresenteerd? Nou, je hebt op aardig wat plekken gepresenteerd. Voor wetenschappers, game developers, professionals en leken. En altijd een knettergoed verhaal. Goed erover nadenken wat de story moet zijn, maar ook wat je audience is. En dan ook nog met die esthetisch mooie presentaties, zoals jullie het vandaag ook gezien hebben. Summer schools bezocht, zoals bijvoorbeeld die in Zwitserland. Zelf symposia en colloquia georganiseerd. Een highlight hier is denk ik het symposium op de Sex Science conferentie in 2019 in Parijs. Waar je echt de big shots uit het veld bij elkaar gekregen had voor een hele innovatieve en relevante sessie. Vond je best wel een beetje spannend, maar het is supergoed gegaan. En dan het schrijven. Tja, het schrijven. Voor velen is dat echt wel een struikelblok. En voor ons begeleiders dan ook. Maar jij schrijft niet snel, nee, dat niet. En ook niet kort, dat ook niet echt. Maar echt als een engel, echt waar, een groot talent. Er is natuurlijk een directe link tussen de geest, de gedachte en hetgeen op papier komt. Jouw geest is helder en diepzinnig. Je zet alleen iets op papier als je iets te vertellen hebt. Pas als het goed doordacht is, geen gelul, geen opscheppen, maar wat een elegantie en overtuigingskracht. Stille wateren hebben diepe gronden. Hoe kan dat nou? Hoe kan het dat je dat allemaal goed lijkt te kunnen? Dat je alles makkelijk afgaat? Nou, ik heb daar wel even over nagedacht en volgens mij is het zijn het soort van transdiagnostische skills die dat allemaal een beetje aan de basis liggen. Misschien moet ik daarop selecteren bij toekomstige PhD-studenten. Nou, allereerst ben je gewoon knetterslim. Dat helpt. Verder ben je heel erg zorgvuldig, nauwkeurig, gestructureerd. En dat zie je terug in het opzetten, begeleiden van studies, maar ook in je analyses doen en ook in je denken en argumentatie. In alles zie je dat terug. En je hebt extreem hoge eisen. Aan jezelf en aan anderen. Soms tot frustratie van die anderen. Ik denk bijvoorbeeld heel graag terug aan onze 2 jongens in de weesstudie. Tegelijkertijd luister en observeer je heel goed. Je bent open en nieuwsgierig, wilt weten hoe het zit en is eigenlijk elk resultaat alleen maar een aanleiding voor weer een nieuwe studie. Ik heb je een hele ontwikkeling zien doormaken wat betreft hoe je denkt over het label depressie, hoe we depressie meten bij mensen, de promise van games als interventie en hoe we effectiviteitsonderzoek het beste kunnen insteken. Je hebt hier echt ideeën over, ideeën die gehoord moeten worden. Een leuk detailtje, Terry Fleming uit Nieuw-Zeeland, die ook in de leescommissie zat, maar nu niet aanwezig kan zijn, heeft je uitgenodigd om samen met haar een opinionartikel te schrijven over gamification voor World Psychiatry. Echt waar, World Psychiatry. Nou, veel hoger wordt het niet qua tijdschriften in ons veld hoor. Eén ding wil ik je ook nog even zeggen, zonder uit te lang op ingegaan. Ik hoop dat je dit oké vindt, maar ik moet het vertellen en ik weet dat jij het natuurlijk anders namelijk niet zou vertellen. Maar het is belangrijk. Al is het maar om te voorkomen dat mensen hier in de zaal denken, oh ja, mooie thesis hoor, mooi boek, maar 9 jaar, dat kan ik ook. Nee, dat kun je niet. En het waren ook geen 9 jaar, want helaas heeft Marlou lange tijd met lichamelijke klachten te maken gehad. Zo erg dat het werken soms helemaal niet meer ging en eigenlijk helemaal niks meer ging. Zoveel pijn en zoveel verdriet. En het heeft lang geduurd voordat je eindelijk de hulp kreeg die je nodig had. Ook dit is iets waar Marlou nooit een groot verhaal van zou maken. Ze wil liever niet moeilijk doen en geen last zijn voor iemand. Stille wateren hebben diepe gronden. Maar op een gegeven moment kon het niet meer, moest je ermee naar buiten. Je hebt geleerd om je kwetsbaar op te stellen en om hulp te zoeken en aan te nemen. Isabela en Mark zijn hierin ook heel belangrijk geweest. Dat was een stap. Het werk bleef je energie geven. Dat was ook in de moeilijkste tijden juist hetgeen waar je voldoening uit haalde. Dus dat bleven we doen. Op aangepast tempo, kijken wat kon. Zo moeilijk vond ik het soms, de machteloosheid, jou zo zien lijden. Uiteindelijk kwam je er weer bovenop. Zo goed. Nou, die stille wateren zie je dus ook bij niet-werkgerelateerde dingen. Ik weet bijvoorbeeld nog heel goed hoe ik helemaal verrast was. Maartje noemde het net al, door een geweldig meerdere gangen menu dat jij voor ons gekookt had op zijn schrijfweek. Inclusief zelfgemaakte ijsjes en al. In haar eentje voor 25 man. En dat doet ze dan ook weer gewoon, zonder veel ophef. Maar ook je enorme creativiteit is iets wat je niet per se meteen aan de buitenkant ziet. Marlou maakt fantastisch mooie kerstkaartjes. Allemaal individueel gemaakt, 1 voor 1 en ontzettend mooi en persoonlijk. Maar het allerverrassendst vond ik nog wel jouw passie voor kostuums. En wat voor kostuums. Zelfgemaakt en echt professioneel. Elke carnavalwinkel is een slechte grap in tegenstelling tot wat jullie maken. Met het hele gezin als Toy Story characters naar Disneyland of als character van Alice in Wonderland. Weer die perfectie, tot in het kleinste detail. Waanzinnig. Van je collega's heb ik me laten vertellen dat die eigenlijk een beetje, maar wel zeer blij verrast waren, dat aan de buitenkant zo lief, aardig, rustig lijkende meisje toch echt helemaal nerdy los kan gaan op LARP-festivals. Ik wist niet wat LARP-festivals zijn. Nou komt die live-action roleplay. Toen als genezen verkleed kwam je toch vrij snel achter, nadat je op het eerste battlefield allemaal gewonden behandeld had, dat dat toch echt niet iets voor jou was en ging je switchen naar alchemist. Dus ook weer die openheid, zien dat iets niet werkt en door met iets anders. Oh ja, en ze kan soms fel uit de hoek komen. Denk je stille rustige Mike, maakt ze ineens een onbeschaamde opmerking. Dat je denkt van, pardon? Oh, en bloedfanatiek bij spelletjes. Echt bloedfanatiek. Dan wordt er ineens gekrijsd en geschreeuwd. Dat kun je je niet voorstellen, ongelooflijk. En dat dan in combinatie met die andere jam-meisjes. Nou, dan kun je het wel shaken dat je vroeg gaat slapen in Obel. Zo, dit brengt me bij het einde van mijn verhaal. Laat dat geschreeuw er maar uit. Er zitten schatten verborgen in die stille wateren. Laat die zien. Laat ze schijnen en glanzen. Ze zijn zo mooi. Ik hoop van harte dat je een plek vindt waar dat kan. Waar je alles kunt laten zien. Als het aan mij ligt, is dat de wetenschap. Met jouw capaciteiten kun je daar heel veel goeds doen. Maar het gaat niet om mij, maar om jou. Dus voor jou wens ik een plek die bij je past, waar je kunt groeien en gelukkig zijn. Ik heb het gezegd.
Well, thank you very much for these kind words. It's my real pleasure to extend congratulations to you on behalf of the Council of Deans. The committee was unanimous in its decision to award you the doctoral degree, but we were also impressed with your performance this afternoon. And we also congratulate the family and each and every one who has provided support in this long journey to today to your doctorate. And I really hope that you will have an opportunity to celebrate in spite of all corona regulations and restrictions. We are all anxiously awaiting the press conference at 7 o'clock tonight, of course. And I hope it won't spoil your party. So thank you very much. We now have come to the conclusion of this ceremony, and I would like you all to stand. Gratias tibi agimus omnipotens Deus pro omnibus beneficiis tuis, qui vivis et regnas per omnia saecula saeculorum.